So
I can do just listen.
But I've got a plug as well. So Brett's done 2 workshops for us in the past where I'm going to deep dives into the world of financial hacking and so on, and he's doing one in November in London. So if you check out stirtoaction.com, we've got a 1-day workshop around alternative finance, central London. Also check out Stir magazine. So we're a quarterly magazine for the new economy. Look at the co-op movement, the commons, loads of community-led alternatives. So thanks to Brett and welcome.
Cool, thank you. I have I can give an introduction again for myself. I'm Brett Scott. I work on a whole range of different things related to the financial sector, loosely categorized under alternative finance, which is just alternative currencies, alternative banking systems, alternative investment funds and things like that. But then also financial reform movements, so particular campaigns around the financial sector. And also I get involved in technology and various different things. So I've also had experience working in the financial sector, so I've got a whole sort of range of different kind of hats on. And if you want, there's a book that I wrote called The Heretics Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money. You can buy it as a normal book, but there's also on a PDF copy now. It's on the internet. You can find it floats around. If you just want to check it out like that, you can also do that. So today we're talking about alternative finance. I don't really have any slides or anything to show you, so I'm just going to try and loosely skirt through this flow diagram that I did. And finance gets quite hard to talk about, so I'm going to try and start from something kind of intuitive to show you different approaches people have to changing the financial sector, maybe.
Can you tell us what you did before you do what you do now? Were you a derivatives trader?
Yeah, you've broken out
A broker. Yeah. We can talk about the technicalities of that if you want, but I mean, brokers are essentially people who help traders buy stuff from each other, buy and sell stuff to each other. But yeah, we can go into high finance later. I mean, high finance is built upon the much more simple finance. It's people often fixate upon it as if it's some kind of magical realm, but in reality, the much more boring finance is what all those higher layers are built on top of. So let's try to start. I mean, at some base level, the financial sector, or finance itself, is essentially it's a whole range of things. But in essence, it's the art of how do you write contracts about the future to make people do things now, or in a roughly speaking, it's how do you mobilize people right now via contracts to do things about the future. And in particular, how do you get money right now in order to mobilize human labor and then give the people who give you money residual claims on what comes from that labor in the future. So this is a key sort of thing what the financial sector really specializes in doing. So it's about how do you mobilize human labor, and then that becomes an entangled web throughout society, and you feel yourself being impacted by it even though you can't see it. This contractual layer that exists over everything. That's kind of a high-level definition, but one of the cool ways to just maybe get some initial concept of this. Let me start with try to go into money first, and if we look at that's how this influences conceptions of alternative money systems. So I'm going to do this thing here where I want to define something called value. All right, so this to me here is a store of value. This is a Coca-Cola in a cup. It has sugar in it. If I drink it, my body starts to do things, and I'm able to carry on having energy and continue to make things. Okay. This here to me has utility, which is one form of value, but also somebody had to make it. There's a production process behind this thing here. So what we loosely call value in this world tends to be something, there's a whole bunch of debate around how you want to define value, but essentially things that we make that have utility. Okay, so usefulness of some sort. And note that, for example, the sunlight doesn't count. Sunlight has infinite utility, but we don't make it. Okay, so sunlight tends to exist outside of market systems because it requires absolutely no labor. It's quite abundant. Okay, anything that's got concept of scarcity in it is essentially a labor process. You have to exert energy to get it. Okay, so things in markets are these things that have labor in them that also we find useful. Okay, so that's like a base level conception of what true value is. It's basically people and their bodies acting upon resources. Okay. Is that controversial? Okay. Now you get into something else. Money has got this really crap way people describe it. They often say it's a store of value. You should just completely screen this idea out of your head entirely. Just remove it. It'll help you a lot if you remove this concept of money being a store of value from your head. The true stores of value are people and resources. Okay, that's value. Okay. Now, the best way to think about money is a claim upon value. Now, the term what I just said, claim upon value, it's a bit too crude. Money is actually a little more complicated than that, but for now, that's essentially what we might define it as. Claim upon value. So, for example, if on this piece of paper I just said, this entitles you to Coca-Cola. That is essentially a claim upon that, Coca-Cola on the ground. If you collectively come to agree that this is actually a legitimate claim upon that, this will essentially become a quasi... In reality, this would be called ownership, actually, in our current society. But let's just forget about that. This could be a quasi-monetary form, all right? I could actually pass this thing around as a way to transfer access to this Coca-Cola, okay? Provided everyone collectively agreed that it was legitimate, okay? So that's like a proto-money form. In reality, our money systems right now, there's not a Coca-Cola on the ground. There's an entire body of human labor, goods made from previous labor, like actual goods floating around, plus services, people who can still act to do new things. Okay, and you can use these claims to essentially mobilize those things or gain access to them. Okay. Now, this is a sort of a key thing to try and get in your mind. And when you start to hear all that complicated stuff about monetary policy, that talking about all the kind of like stuff that central banks are doing, a large part of what's happening is the attempt to manipulate the layer of claims in order to manipulate the layer of human activity. Okay, and there's interrelations between these two things. Okay. Now, is that kind of clear? All right. So now we don't go into the history of like how these money systems have come about. But that's an important point. Now, normally, when we're imagining money, we often imagine this physical form, this physical object, this claim represented as a physical certificate almost, potentially, like a note, like the pounds here. You can implement this in a different way, and I'll show you how. Okay, it's the exact same thing. You can use what's called a ledger. And this becomes very important if you want to understand banking. Because this is like the core part of what banking does. On a ledger system, I just have a piece of paper or a notebook or something like that, and I write down entries for different people. So I'm going to say Johnny, okay, and sorry, what's your name? Deb, okay. You guys have entries on my ledger, okay? Now, imagine if I wanted to transfer this in this form to Johnny, I would walk across to him and I would give it to him, okay? Now imagine I'm actually going to make an entry for myself as well. Brett gets an entry too. Imagine what we do is we scrumple this up and destroy it, and rather represent it as a 1 on here, okay? Now this essentially is a data object. You've created a representation of something on a form, and people imagine it as being a thing. Okay, you can see it's like a thing, right, on the paper. All right, it's a data object. If you want to move the data object around, you essentially edit this document. So I want to now move it to Johnny. So I cross out my 1 and I attribute it to Johnny. That's conceptually exactly the same thing as me walking across to him and giving him a physical representation of it. Now, if Johnny wants it to transfer it to Deb, bear in mind, I am the one who controls this ledger. So what does he have to do?
Ask you.
He has to ask you. You have to ask me. Okay, so you send me a message, you prove somehow that you are Johnny, and you say, I would like to transfer it to Deb. And I say, okay, fine, I agree that you are Johnny, and move now to Deb. Okay, this is a payment system, essentially whereby a person who controls a database moves around monetary claims between different accounts for people. The only thing you need for this is you need to trust the person who maintains the accounts. You need to have a secure communication system between people, and they need to have a way to authenticate themselves so they don't engage in fraud and pretend to be somebody else and transfer it to a different account that they control or something, right? So you need these forms of and these are the two essential different ways you can implement a monetary system. So for example, with the Exeter pounds here, rather than having those physical notes, what you could just do is take them all out of circulation and have an Excel spreadsheet with everybody's names on and just say, oh, you have 20 Exeter pounds. And then they could use their phones to move it around between themselves via text messages to a database. Okay, so that'd be a different way to implement exactly the same system. So that's I'm going to stop there for that. The key thing now with modern banking is another layer to this. Okay. So the modern banking system has another special power, which is what they call credit creation. Mark.
Yes.
Mark, you look like you're in need of some credit. Okay. I'm gonna add on exactly the same database. I'm going to add a new account for you. Okay. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to assume you want credit from me. I'm just going to say, oh, there we go, you got 5. Okay. What I will simultaneously do on a different database somewhere else is say, you owe me 5.5. That's a separate contract we have between ourselves. But right now, you have 5 in money from me. Okay. Now this is a very crude description of how the banking credit creation process works. It's more complicated than that, and there's a whole system of reserves behind it. But essentially what banks are doing with these database systems is attributing people with new claims. So when you go, for example, get a mortgage and instead £300,000 or something, I don't know, it depends on, I don't have a mortgage, but essentially what they're doing is they open a new data entry for you in this thing and they write some new numbers in, and that becomes something that they promised you essentially, okay? This is what, we don't go into the complexities of the reserve system, but you can extend these monetary claims into society, and thereby you can actually mobilize people's labor, all right? So you can say, I want to extend money into this particular situation and make people build a whole bunch of houses. Okay, so this has a lot of creative power in it, this ability to extend these claims upon, and then when you get into the dark arts of proper monetary policy, you start to see this interaction between a central bank, where the reserve system is, and all these commercial banks who have all these private databases for themselves, who are extending credit into the economy via this process. And the central bank is trying to influence the activities of the commercial banks to try and influence what's happening in the underlying human labor pool. So for example, with this deep unemployment, it means people are not able to use their bodies to work. All right, and the central bank is saying we're going to try and do something to make this different or to change the situation. Okay. So that's all I'm going to do for existing monetary system. Is that kind of roughly clear enough for a start? Okay, now I'm going to try to talk about the basic ways you alter this system. Okay. Just going to take a sip of this value.
Bankers do.
Okay. Okay. One thing to bear in mind with these systems nowadays is that banks do not write them on pieces of paper. Okay. In the old days, banks used to maintain these in old, huge books, actual, literal, physical ledgers. Okay, like these massive books. Nowadays, they've transferred that all across to digital databases. Okay. And in the old days, you might actually, to go and interact with that ledger, you might have to walk into this branch and ask the guy to change the data entries for you in the book, right? Nowadays, you can interact with those ledgers via mobile phones, your computer, any telecommunication system, so you can phone them, you can walk into a branch, you can send them a text message. There's any number of ways you can interact with these databases. But the key thing is essentially this money is being brought into existence and moved around via the act of banks editing databases. Okay, that's the important point. There's a whole world in London which is called fintech, financial technology, and often they'll host conferences where they say the future of money, and it's all like, you know, these big banks come and get involved, and Wired magazine and all these like scenesters will come and they're like talk about the future of money. Essentially what they are talking about is how do we build new user experience layers over the existing system. Okay, so this core of the banking system stays exactly the same, and they say, how can we find a slightly more kind of user-friendly way of interacting with those databases? So maybe, you know, you're going to have a new app on your phone that sends a message for you, you just sweep it over something, rather than having to manually type in your details, or something like that, right? Maybe you'll use your fingerprint to identify yourself, and it'll send the message into these databases to do the editing. This is what they call the fintech scene, and it's about essentially digitizing the existing user experience of the financial sector. It's a very cosmetic change in general, although occasionally there's some kind of interesting things that happen in it. But be very skeptical if you see some news report in, you know, for example, The Guardian or the Financial Times or something, where they say all the fintech disruptors who are, you know, fundamentally changing the financial sector. It tends to be like absolutely not true. They tend to be building a layer on top of the existing system. Okay. One of the key big breakthroughs that was made in the last few years was finding a way, and this is like, so the first way people talk about to change financial sector is to change the user experience layer. The second thing you can do is you can change the power dynamics of who controls these ledgers. In the existing system, essentially these highly centralized oligarchy of banks control these transaction ledgers that keep score of your money and extend credit. The major technological breakthrough that's altered this has been the cryptocurrency space. Now, if you're interested in Bitcoin, this is the only real thing that Bitcoin's done. It hasn't really altered very much in many other spaces, but the key political dynamic of Bitcoin was essentially it made it possible for people to collectively run this database between themselves, rather than relying on a central intermediary to keep control of it. Okay? Now note, you can have exactly the same monetary, sort of this concept of moving these monetary tokens around on a database, but instead of asking a single person to change it for you, the Bitcoin system essentially asks a whole network of people to change it. And there's a whole sort of cryptographic process by which it happens, but the key dynamic is there is no single party who's changing it. All right? But the same thing happens. You can move them between different accounts for people.
And there's no usury,
Sorry?
There's no usury, no interest.
That's yeah, sure. We could go and let's not complicate it on that for now. The key point I'm trying to get across is the underlying profound impact of blockchain, if you're interested, is merely the fact that it controls the power dynamics of who controls these ledgers. Okay. So I'm going to leave that there for now. We can go back to questions about the particular dynamics of it. Okay. The third thing you can do if you want to change monetary systems, though, is you can change who gets to issue it. Okay, you can maintain a single person, in, you know, for example, doing the editing, but you can have a process whereby, for example, there's community control of who gets issued with credit. Okay, so if you look at mutual credit systems, this is what mutual credit systems are about. Have you guys ever come across mutual credit systems? Mutual credit system essentially is a way for a community to issue money in the form of short-term credit to each other. How we would do it in the room like this would be, again, I'd set up a ledger with lands like this. Everybody would put their names down in one of the lands. If one of you then went and gave your labor to somebody else, actually put energy into something, you would be positively credited on this ledger. You would ask me, the central keeper of the ledger, to change this for you, and I'd say, sorry, what's your name? Nikki. Okay. So Nikki, you've done, let's say something for Mark now. I say, Nikki, you get +2. And let's not think about what the pricing system is. Let's just say 2 represents your work in some way. And Mark, you go -2. Okay, I've now recorded that on the system here. The key dynamic, though, about a mutual credit system is that these then become socialized, okay, between everybody else. So Mark can redeem. Mark essentially is in debt right now. He has to go back and give labor back into the system. He's received it from somebody. Now he has to go back in and give it back. But he doesn't have to give it back to Nikki. He can give it back to somebody else in the system. Okay, as a way to go back to 0 essentially on this list. Okay, and Nikki, you would be able to redeem your previous labor for somebody else's labor, but it doesn't have to be Mark. It could be anybody else in the system. And overall, the whole point of this is to try and create a circulation of economic energy between people. All right, and what you will do when you're doing it with each other, you will send me messages saying, "Hey Brett, I did this work here. Now please change my account." And you go to 0, and somebody else goes to +2. And I'd be like changing these accounts between people, recording the various obligations. Okay. Now note, that's a centrally controlled database, but a community money issuance process. If you wanted to put this into a blockchain format, you could essentially create a decentralized version of the same database and have like a kind of weird crypto mutual credit system if you wanted to blend those two things together. Okay. You don't have to though, it's not necessarily a very efficient idea. Okay. So that's another way to change money. Okay, a fourth way to change money is to change what the actual claims are redeemable for. Okay, so let's go back to the simple list here. Right now, these units on this ledger enable you to get anything that's in the community, essentially, or anything in the economy. Let's imagine they're pounds. Okay. Imagine now you want to say, we want to put redeemability restrictions upon these units to say that actually they will not be, you cannot legitimately use them, for example, for products that have over a certain amount of carbon embedded in them. Okay, imagine you implemented the money system and said, these are legitimate insofar as the labor you're attempting to get isn't high carbon. And some of this labor I'm using is a bit like loose, but like essentially you're trying to encourage the creation of a certain type of economy through redeemability restrictions on the money. And actually, local currencies do this. So the Exeter pound, for example, what's essentially happened is that there's been a redeemability restriction placed on it, which says this will only be redeemable within this particular localized region. And the reason why we want to place that redeemability restriction is because we believe we have an economic theory that says localism is better. Okay, you could place different redeemability restrictions. You could say it could be redeemed through an entire country, but only for a certain type of thing. So these are redeemability type factors. I noticed that you could actually, that could be like a normal pound. So the Brixton pound, which I'm part of, essentially takes normal British pounds with the normal dynamics of the monetary system and replaces redeemability restrictions upon them. Okay, so it doesn't have a community money issuance process like a mutual credit system. So you can see how these different types of monetary alternatives try to target slightly different kind of end goals. Is that kind of like, I think, so we've done, change the user experience layer of the banking system, change the dynamics of who gets to control the databases, change who gets to issue credit, essentially, or issue the money, change what it's redeemable for. Okay, another one. This is kind of like an unpopular thing to do in money systems generally, but you can start to tinker with the actual properties of the individual claims. Okay, so for example, demurrage systems do this. If you guys have come across these, essentially you say these units, or let's say it was done in a physical form as like an actual note. If you do not use it, it will start to disintegrate. Okay, you've placed an internal sort of like intrinsic characteristic to the token or claim, which it'll do something of its own accord, as it were. I mean, actually, it'll be somebody doing it, which will change your behavior towards it. Okay. So, for example, right now the Exeter pound is a local currency, so it's got redeemability restrictions on it. But you might also add another layer which says, okay, not only will it have redeemability restrictions, but we'll now also put this internal characteristic that if you do not use it, it will start to essentially disintegrate in value. Okay, that's a bit to encourage circulation. So the redeemability keeps it in a certain area, but if you want to speed the circulation, then you add a new characteristic. Okay, but bear in mind, every single time you add these new restrictions and new types of characteristics, you alter the whole sort of way people might use it, or it might make it harder for them to use it. They might actually back away. So there's a lot of this alternative currency design stuff involves people taking these different design parameters and trying to sort of blend them together in a way that attracts people and doesn't sort of alienate them from, and has to sort of compete with the existing system that surrounds it. Okay. Another thing you can do, moving slightly away from money systems, is that you can try to bypass exchange entirely. Okay, so I gave 5 kind of like monetary alterations, but there's a whole sort of world around people who say, actually, rather than having these exchange systems, let's have gift systems. Okay, so I'm imagining this weekend there'll probably be stuff around gift economy occurring. If you look at what essentially gift economy is trying to do, it's saying, in these systems here, there's a measurement process going on, right? So when Nikki does some work and she wants me to change this ledger for her to say, I've done this and please, or say, let's say, please transfer something to Mark, there's some idea of some measured exchange that's occurred. Like, I did this, now give me that. Okay? And there's more or less fair ways of doing that. But nevertheless, the basic moral structure is, I do this, now that. Whole world of like how you change investment banks and investment funds. But let's try to maybe focus just on this for now.
Yeah.
Reflection.
Any questions?
Yeah, I've got a question. Simple question about bitcoins. I've never used them. Is it just like passing a pound note to somebody else? Or is there some global visibility of who owns what in bitcoins?
No, Bitcoin's not like passing a pound note to somebody else. It is a ledger system like this, okay?
So a distributed database?
It's a distributed database system. So let's just go back in the normal banking sector. If you want to transfer your monetary tokens from one person to another, you identify yourself to your bank and you say, so what's your name?
John.
You say, hey, I'm John. I can prove that I'm John. I have this particular account here. Please would you edit my account? And for example, you want to transfer £200. So you say, to Deb. You want to transfer 200 to Deb. You say, Deb's at another bank, her account is this. Please get the other bank to edit her account. Okay, and then what will happen is that the 2 banks will edit those ledgers, and then they'll go to the central bank, and there's another process that then occurs there where they settle it between themselves. Okay, but what in the end happens is essentially that this money is quote unquote moved. It hasn't, because it hasn't really moved. What's changed is data. And there's an implied move of things by the change in the data, okay? Through the editing of those ledgers, but they are the essential intermediaries who control these ledgers. The Bitcoin system is actually very similar. In the Bitcoin system, there is also a ledger or a database. You also have an account. Okay, they call it a public address, which is what represents you on the database. Okay, then you have a private key, which is sort of roughly akin to a PIN code, a way to prove that you control that account, but nobody else knows what it is, okay? You basically send messages into the system saying, I wish to take tokens that are currently attributed to my account and attribute them to somebody else's account. Okay, and you send this into the network and you basically request for this ledger to be changed. Now the key thing that happens is rather than being changed by a banking, imagine like a clerk as it were, a decentralized network of, kind of imagine them as like techno clerks, compete with each other to change the database for you. Okay, essentially. That's like a very crude way of saying it. But they try to like compete to put it onto the ledger, and they get rewarded for that process through I don't want to go into this necessarily, but the key sort of trick in Bitcoin was they tied the maintenance of that payment system with a money issuance process. To say, as a reward for maintaining the payment system, i.e. recording these movements, the first thing you'll get to do if you write new stuff onto the database is you'll get to write a little entry for yourself saying, I've got money myself. Okay, 25 new Bitcoins. That's your reward for doing it. Okay, so they're very, and there's a whole bunch of cryptography on this, but that's how they essentially got incentivize a whole group of people who literally don't know each other to all work together to maintain this giant sort of system. There's a lot of problems in Bitcoin, don't get me wrong, you want to romanticize it, but the technology was authentically interesting. And one of the things that's happening with this stuff right now is people are imagining, okay, that's a database ledger, as it were, that's being used to transfer tokens between each other. What else could we do with that same concept? For example, could we have a giant decentralized cooperative where we have shares and we use this sort of technology to coordinate ourselves? Traditional cooperatives are often small scale, involve people who know each other in some kind of way, or at least have some kind of... could you hypothetically do it at a much larger scale via this type of technology? It's an unanswered question, but that's one of the kind of key things what's called in blockchain 2.0 thinking, which is going beyond Bitcoin.
Basic thing is, like banks, they charge you money to operate it.
Yeah.
Transaction.
Yeah, so we got a question here and then over at the back. Do you want to go first?
Okay, it's a very simple question, but I just wanted to clarify that because sunshine and wind is free, that every government and large corporation will fight tooth and nail to stop it being used because they can't make money from it.
Well, they can control the land base where you harvest it.
That's all they can do. Yeah, okay. They've got us always then on renewable energy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, of course, but the actual cost of something like solar is not the sun itself; it's the technology that harnesses it and the land and that kind of thing. So those are scarce things. You know, so those and that's where the choke points will be. I'm imagining.
I have a question about, which is related to housing actually, because it's just like with money creation. So in Bristol, for example, houses that were 4 years ago were £160,000. Now are £300,000 3 years later. And I've always wondered how does that interact? So that's created. So someone buys that house, and so that's created, £140,000 somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I've always wondered how does that tie in to the wider economic system? Because you've got like assets which increase in value, but you've got we've got what you call a housing bubble potentially in this country, haven't we, where the price of assets just going through the roof. Mm-hmm. How does that interact with the money creation? Because where does that extra money really come from? You know what I mean?
That's interest, isn't it? Everything's getting more expensive because we pump money into the system to keep it afloat because it's all fake. It's like.
But where does the on a ledger?
I mean,
you see what I mean?
There's only essentially. That's my answer question. There's not many things that banks can actually do. There's essentially like 4 main categories of things they can do. Let me try to do this very, very fast. I need my hands as well. Can you guys hear me there? So, essentially what they're doing is they're operating with 2 ledger systems. So if you go and deposit money in a bank, what they're doing is they take from you, put it into a central bank account, and then simultaneously promise it to you like that. Okay? And they say, you see this, all right, and they got this. To them, this represents a promise that they've made. Okay, it's a liability to a bank, but it's completely backed by something they actually have in another account. Okay, the payment, so that's like the deposit system. Okay, the payment system is, let's say we want to make this move between one bank and another bank. They say, okay, you want to move our promises to you. What I'm going to do, I'm going to reduce the number of promises I have to you, and I'm simultaneously going to move some of this to another bank's account over here. Okay, so they reduce their reserves and they simultaneously reduce their promises. So these are both processes which are backed one to one. It's like it's coming into my account, I'm promising it to you. Going out of my account, I'm removing my promises from you. Okay, the credit creation process, this stays exactly the same, and they just increase the number of promises they make. Okay.
Does the fiat.
All right.
Money.
But now, once they've done that, you can go back to the normal payment system to say, okay, now I promised this guy that he could have a house. 300,000 was what I created, but now he actually wants to buy the house. So now he wants to enter the payment system to transfer the 300,000 to somebody else's bank. Now, I have to now go and make sure I have enough in my central bank account, central bank reserve account, that if he actually does that, I can transfer it to somebody else's, another bank central bank reserve account. So that debt now starts to move throughout the system between the banks themselves, okay, via the payment system. And when the repayment process happens, essentially what happens is that, again, they keep the reserve static and they just reduce the number of promises they can make to you. So when you're paying back your loan, what's happening is that they are just saying, we no longer promise you anything, okay? But we're going to keep money in our central bank reserve accounts. That kind of like sounds, maybe just dwell on it. But the net effect of what happens is that essentially money from society starts to go into their accounts. Okay, if you start to model it out. So it's very, very hard to think about on net when there's like tons of lending going into the housing sector, they're pumping up the overall money supply. That then gets pushed around via the various, people who, the guy who bought the house, transferred to somebody else's account, they then paying for coffee and whatever's going on, right? It's getting moved around the system. And then they try, on net, people start trying to pay back. And all these sort of these processes are going on in the back where the banks are now trying to extract. And if they haven't actually managed to lend it correctly, they'll get screwed. I don't know if that really explains your question, but it's quite like a hard thing to model at least.
It's just the point of like someone's bought the house for 160, so they borrowed 160,000 to buy the house initially.
Yeah.
Well,
and so the banks will lend. The banks love lending or extending credit to the housing sector because
make money on it.
there's a vicious circle that occurs when you extend to consumer lending like that or asset lending, is that it pushes up the price in the market system. And so this is kind of vicious cycle, and people like Hyman Minsky and stuff study that kind of asset price cycles and crashes and stuff. So the credit extension process, if done badly, can lead to these huge kind of fallouts in the system.
Got a question at the front.
I have a slightly different understanding of the system in that the credit money is created when you ask for it. If you go to a bank and you ask for £1,000, they create that. They become richer by £1,000 because you've asked for the money, and the point is that you give them a promise to pay them back £1,000, and that is actually the thing of value, the promissory note. Your promise to give them back something of value is what they get to keep, and they actually get the £1,000. They create £1,000.
So this is a common misconception of money creation. The banks, what they do is they promise you something. So the money creation is the act of them promising you access to their reserves.
But that only happens because you ask for it.
So you could be like a business, you could be an entrepreneur asking me for a loan, whatever, or a person asking for a mortgage, all that could be forcing on you. It doesn't really matter who asks for it. But basically there's a process going on. The key thing that happens is that as I make that promise to you, I extract another promise back from you. So I give you a short-term promise. I say, hey, here's 300,000 if you want to go get it, okay? In exchange, I'm going to make another contract on the side which says you owe me 330,000. I'm extracting a 30,000 in the future. I'm hoping that's going to flow back to my central bank reserve account, and I'm going to be able to, this is what this process is trying to say. As they're making these short-term promises, they're simultaneously extracting long-term promises that are higher in value. Okay, so that's fine in certain contexts, provided that's...
What I mean is that you give them an agreement to pay them something. That's something of value, right? To the value of £300,000 plus interest, right? That's always going to be the case, plus costs and interest.
But it's not their money. It's not. So when people say like, oh, so the bank created,
you create it by signing a piece of paper. You create the promissory note. There's nothing of value before that. It's just digits on the screen in the bank account, right? They don't have gold in the bank to back up the 300,000 they're giving you. They have 10% of that, 30,000, because that's fractional reserve. So they create the money. Well, okay. Well, we should talk about it later.
Sure. So the point I just want to make about money creation, because this confuses people a lot. When a bank creates, let's say, $1 million, it's not for itself. It's making you a promise Okay, that's what the creation is. What it creates for itself is a long-term asset which says, in the future, I will get $1.5 million or something, or like $1,100,000. Okay, so what the money they've created a differential between their short-term promises and their long-term assets, and that's going to create in the long term a flow of money towards them. Okay. And that's the key thing. They themselves, that million is actually a legal promise to you. They can't
disagree. There's no piece of paper that backs up the bank's promise.
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes left, so I reckon it's a conversation for later. But let's just have one more question. Did I miss anyone? So yeah, over.
How does quantitative easing fit into this model?
Quantitative easing is a process whereby, I was doing all this like hand waving stuff. Central bank reserve accounts, promises to society, and this is through the active extension of credit. Quantitative easing is when the central bank's trying to influence all these reserve accounts. They say we're going to pump up your reserve accounts and make essentially alter the differential between your assets and your liabilities. So to inspire them to try and extend more credit. Often what will actually happen, for example, when banks are highly or over leveraged, for example, they'll just keep it there and they won't do anything. So this is all the dynamics of monetary policy, whether that process works or not. There are many alternative ways to do that same thing, for example, by directly giving it to people or like, so that's quite a technical debate, so just maybe not go into it right now.
Cool, and definitely last question.
So in the crash course, Martinson talks about there's a credit crisis. We've got to go on increasing credit. It's fine because each, personal credit and national credit and so on, each of them requires a certain amount of interest and therefore requires growth to keep on paying that interest. But at some stage that growth won't happen. So his idea of a crash is partly a credit crash. But so, who owns this credit? I mean, if we all owe something, then can't we just say, well, that's it, let's just forget it all?
Bear in mind that, so it's true that having an interest built into a system essentially mobilizes people to work, right? So this is how you create high growth systems, is that you create these debt systems.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but if you hit up against the limits of that, it just breaks. These are contracts, remember. So you cannot manufacture value out of nothing. Like if there is nothing there. So for example, if I was a bank and I went onto an island that had nothing there and I extended enormous amounts of credit, it wouldn't do anything. It would just be nothing essentially. So you can only extend credit within the constraints of your actual human labor and resource pool. Okay, that's the natural constraint to all economies. And if you go over that, essentially people become over indebted and they just can't work. Well, it's like, well, I actually can't do that thing that you said it would. So the system just breaks. So you have jubilees, for example, you have bankruptcies. So all the bankruptcy processes, debt forgiveness processes are essentially when the credit extension process has gone over the actual limits of the society that it operates with. Until it does that, though, it makes people work like hell, because you're trying to you've mobilized them to do all this stuff.
But a lot of this austerity discussion is about we're putting debts on future generations.
Yeah. There's huge over indebtedness. Yeah.
So how does that work?
I think that's it. Yeah.
But maybe the point to take away is that just bear in mind in any economic system, your underlying value base are your people and your resources. And then you can write all these contractual systems over it, which say, you have to do this and this and this, and you can mobilize people in different ways within those constraints, but you can't go over it. So for example, with money creation, you can't just be like, I'm going to just create, $1 trillion. Because, well, what will happen is the system actually literally cannot handle it, so it will just reject it. So the banks are playing a fine game. The banks are always trying to maintain the integrity of the economy whilst also extracting. So they don't want to kill the thing that they work off. So this is the whole sort of balance of how they try to protect their own interests whilst not killing the golden goose, as it were. So this is
So we got to call it time, I'm afraid. Otherwise, we're going to replicate a system which the economists are squeezing out the young people.
Cool. Well, I can always chat later as well. So thanks.
Okay, great. So thanks very much.